That even worked without the microphone. Well, welcome back. We now have Sandy Goldberg with us from Northwestern University, and he's going to tell us about the asymmetry thesis and the doctrine of normative defeat.
Thank you. First, I'd like to echo the sentiment of the previous speakers and thank the organizers, and in particular, just one quick comment to Eleanor and to John. I really think that it's a mark of your leadership that this group exhibits such lovely norms of conferences, because we all know that in philosophy it can happen that the norms of conferences can vary from place to place, and sometimes it can be very unfriendly, and sometimes it can be both friendly and helpful in the sense of critical helpful. And I just wanted to say thank you to the both of you for your leadership on this. I think it really is. Yes, and by friendly I mean very friendly, especially the person who's speaking now. That's correct, Lizzie. You read right through that one. And I also would like to thank the graduate students who have done just a wonderful job organizing all this. And I would ask everyone to just join with me to thank all of you. So I often, when I give talks, or even in graduate classes, will write IOUs. And that is to say, I'll make a claim. The claim is usually very, very controversial, and I have no argument for it. And so inevitably, somebody in the audience or a graduate student will call me on it, and I'll say, I don't have the argument now, but I'll write you an IOU. I'll get back to you on this. And what I've learned over the years is that I rarely pay off my IOUs. It's not a good bet. Today, I'm going to be paying off an IOU. It's an IOU that arose when I first started thinking about normative defeat. And it's an IOU that I realized I had. I think it was in conversation with my colleague Jennifer Lackey, I think, although she may correct me if I'm wrong on this, where as a card-carrying reliabilist, I found myself wanting to appeal to normative defeaters, but in particular to normative defeaters of a certain kind. And I think it was Jennifer who said to me, are you sure that as a reliabilist you're allowed to do this? And I'm pretty confident at the time my answer was, no, I'm not sure about this, but that's an IOU and I will try to pay this one off. So today I'm going to try to tell you why I think that was a problem, what the problem was, and I'm going to begin to sketch what I regard as an attempt to answer the problem. It will not depend on reliabilism or any particular theory of justification. The idea simply is this. It's interesting to think about the category of evidence that you should have had. Not evidence that you have, but evidence that you should have had. And some of us think that in cases where you should have had evidence, and where the evidence is such that were you to have had it, you would no longer be justified in believing as you do, that evidence can defeat your justification even when you don't have that evidence. That is, even when it's not in your possession. That's not an idea that everyone accepts, but it is an idea that many of us accept. And recently, in a series of papers, I've begun to think about, or try to figure out exactly how does evidence come to have this significance. Today, I'm dealing with one small part of that problem, and it's what I call the asymmetry thesis. And the asymmetry thesis is easy to state. It goes like this. Evidence in your possession can help you or hurt you. It can help you if it justifies, it can hurt you if your evidence goes against what you believe. Then it ends up making it the case that you're not justified in believing. But if this doctrine of normative defeat is true, that evidence that you should have had can defeat your justification, then it looks like evidence that you don't have can only hurt you. It can't help you. So it looks like there's an interesting asymmetry here between evidence that's in your possession, which can either help or hurt you, and evidence not in your possession, which can only hurt you. And the question is, how can evidence that you don't have that status? How can it be epistemically significant at all? And once you figure out how it can be epistemically significant at all, that is, have any bearing on the justification of your belief, why should we think that it can only have negative bearing on the justification of your belief? That asymmetry thesis is a thesis that I realize I think I'm stuck with. I think I actually have to acknowledge it. And I think that any of us who have been convinced by certain examples that I'm going to go over in a little while, who have been convinced by those examples as examples of normative defeat, we are going to be stuck with the asymmetry thesis. And so the aim today is just to give you an account of how it can come to pass that there can be evidence that has this status. Namely, you don't have it. It can bear against your justification, but it can't support you. It can't provide justification. And when I say it can bear against your justification, I don't mean that it does. I just mean that it has that potential. So the name of the game is going to be to give an account of how all of that can be. I am not going to aim to convince those of you who don't like the doctrine of normative defeat, as I understand it. There will be some of you who actually think that the doctrine of normative defeat, as I'll formulate it in a moment, is not something that's true. I don't have an argument for you. At best, all I have is, here's an interesting way in which, if it were true, it could be true. But I don't have an argument for you. I'm presupposing that it's true and asking, okay, so what is it that motivates this? What kind of account can we give of this kind of evidence? Okay. So let me start with just a very brief overview of the problem. I think that it's uncontroversial to suppose that if there's evidence in your possession, it can help you when the evidence supports what you believe, and it can hurt you when the evidence goes against what you believe. I'm going to frame this, hopefully uncontroversial thesis as the significance of possessed evidence. Evidence in S's possession can either enhance or detract from the doxastic justification of S's belief that P. I'm pretty confident that there won't be many people in the audience, if anyone, who will challenge that. I'm going to take it for granted. Here's a doctrine, the next doctrine, that has to do with unpossessed evidence. Second part of what I'll call the asymmetry thesis is the significance of unpossessed evidence. This thesis is not uncontroversial, but as I'll go on to explain, I think it is one that many of us will accept. And it says the following: evidence not in S's possession cannot enhance the doxastic justification of S's belief that P, but there are circumstances under which such evidence can undermine or defeat that justification. If you put these two things together, and I'll talk about why you might want to endorse SUE in a second, you get the asymmetry thesis. The asymmetry is just in the different treatment that we give to evidence in our possession versus evidence not in our possession, that while the former can either help or hurt, the latter can only hurt. Now, as I say, the asymmetry thesis is controversial, and it's controversial because the significance of unpossessed evidence is controversial. But I think that there will be many of us in this room who are under some pressure to accept it. And that's because we endorse a view whose best argument requires something like the asymmetry thesis. And that's the doctrine of normative defeat. The doctrine of normative defeat, which is the last thing on page 1, I actually didn't formulate it properly, but so let me just read it and then tell you what I mean by it. As I put it here, there are circumstances under which one or more propositions which S should believe but doesn't believe, when those propositions defeat the justification for S's belief that P. Normative defeat in the literature comes in at least two varieties. One of the varieties is more easy to handle. That's the variety on which you have evidence to believe something, but you just don't believe it. So the proposition for which you have evidence can defeat your justification for believing something else because you have evidence for believing that proposition. That kind of normative defeat, I don't think, is quite as hard to handle as the case that I'm interested in. The case that I'm interested in is when you don't have the evidence in the first place. So the proposition that captures the content of the evidence you don't have can be such that that proposition defeats your justification. When I talk about normative defeat, it's only going to be that case that I have in mind, where you don't have the evidence. Not the case where you have the evidence but haven't formed the belief, but the case where you don't have the evidence. These are going to be cases where you should have had the evidence. And this should have had is something that I'm fascinated by. And I want to try to theorize about it. So I say, if you buy the doctrine of normative defeat, in the sense that you think that in cases where there's evidence you should have had, and you think that evidence can defeat your justification, you're going to be under some pressure to accept the asymmetry thesis. Why? Because the best examples that we have, the best arguments that we have for the doctrine of normative defeat, in the cases that I'm thinking of, are all cases in which, given the evidence that a person has, she's justified in believing as she does, but nevertheless we have the intuitive sense that we should render her belief unjustified. There are three cases in the literature, three classic cases I think that all of us have thought about, who think about these things. And all three cases have this structure. I'm going to go over them very briefly, but all three cases have this structure. The first case that I want to call to your attention, that is of this kind, comes from Hilary Kornblith in, I think it was an '83 paper where he was still talking about justification. Those were back in the days when Hilary was still talking about justification. And Hilary imagined, and I think he actually raised this as an objection to evidentialism, he imagined the case of the physicist who simply ignored, in the sense of didn't even attend to and didn't comprehend and didn't listen to his colleagues when they criticized his views. Hilary imagined that case being such that the physicist actually had a lot of evidence for his views, but he simply tuned people out when they were speaking to him. And to make the case plausible, let's imagine that this was just a general character flaw in his. It's not that as soon as he thought that they were saying something against him, he tuned them out. Let's imagine it's a general character flaw. He just didn't listen to other people. And so despite the fact that he had 3 or 4 colleagues who had excellent criticisms of his theory, he didn't hear any of them. Hilary's verdict in that case, the verdict that he wanted a theory of justification to deliver, was that the physicist was unjustified in his belief. Of course, he didn't have the evidence that rendered him unjustified, but he was unjustified in his belief. And Hilary thought this was a criticism of evidentialism, because he thought evidentialism, at least as Rich and Earl were defending it at the time, that they could not acknowledge this was a case of unjustified belief. And in fact, Rich and Earl, if I remember correctly, conceded that this was not a case of unjustified belief, and then tried to explain away Hilary's impression that it was a case. But there's a case where, given the evidence that the physicist has, he looks like he's justified. It's just that there's evidence he should have had, and the intuitive sense is that we want to say he's unjustified. Why does this force you to endorse something like the asymmetry thesis? For the obvious reason that in order to get the unjustified verdict, you're going to have to regard the evidence he doesn't have as bearing negatively on the justification of his belief. That was one case. Another case, this is a case that John Pollock published in one of the editions of his Introduction to Epistemology book, where Pollock imagines somebody standing in her room, whatever room she has in her house where she keeps her letters, and she has a belief, and we're going to imagine that she has lots of evidence for her belief, and there's a letter addressed to her on the table. She hasn't opened it up and so hasn't looked at the contents. And as Pollock imagines, if she had opened up the letter and looked in its contents, she would have read something that would have rendered her belief unjustified. And Pollock's comment is really quite interesting on this. He says, he's talking about knowledge, not justification. But he says, in this case, we would regard her as not knowing that P, even though she doesn't have the evidence in virtue of which her belief that P fails to amount to knowledge, the evidence that defeats the justification. Why? He says something like, because it is expected of people that they read their mail. I actually think this is a nice point, and I'm going to try to use this point to develop my theory, but the idea is this, once again, she doesn't have the evidence. Pollock says she doesn't know. In this case, she doesn't know. I'm going to say she's not justified. I don't actually think Pollock actually drew that conclusion, but if you know your Pollock better than I do, you'll tell me. But he certainly drew the conclusion that she doesn't know. I want to draw the conclusion that she's not justified. Again, another case where a person has a set of evidence. Given the evidence she has, it looks like she's justified. If you have the intuition in this case that she's unjustified, it can only be because the evidence she doesn't have bears negatively on her justification. And then the last case, that's the famous case that we all think about. The earliest of the three cases, but in some ways the most complicated of the three cases, comes from Gil Harman's 1973 book, Thought, the famous case that many of us have talked about in other settings, the famous newspaper case. This is the case in which, call her Jane. Jane reads a newspaper in the morning. She lives in a country that's been somewhat unstable. She reads in the newspaper in the morning that there's been a coup. She comes to believe there's been a coup. In fact, there has been a coup. By the afternoon, the junta that actually created the coup puts out a new newspaper disclaiming that there's been a coup. They want to do a disinformation campaign. And everybody in the country has read this newspaper except for Julia. And the claim is this. Harman's claim was this. She doesn't know that there's been a coup. Why not? Well, because there's evidence that she should have had that she doesn't have, namely the evidence in the newspaper, in the second version of the newspaper. What's interesting to many of us in this case is that that evidence is misleading. But even so, Harman thought, I think, again, Harman was talking about knowledge, not justification. But even so, Harman thought, that evidence bears epistemically on her epistemic state. I want to say it bears against her justification. She's not justified because there's evidence that she should have had, which is such that had she had it, she wouldn't have been justified. So if you like these verdicts in any of these cases, that these subjects are not, their belief is not doxastically justified, if you like those verdicts, it looks like you're under pressure to endorse the asymmetry thesis. Why? Because you're going to, I think the only way to get those verdicts is by regarding the evidence that the subject doesn't have as bearing against the justification of the belief. Now I say not all of you will have this intuition. I suspect there are some who don't have this intuition. I suspect especially if you got your PhD at Rochester, you will not have this intuition. And those are not the only people that won't have this intuition. But I certainly think that there's a good predictor there. If you don't have this intuition, you're likely to endorse the thesis that I call the doctrine of inertness. Evidence not in one's possession is epistemically inert. It can neither enhance nor detract from the doxastic justification of one's belief that P. I do think that view is the view that folks who are educated in the Rochester variety of epistemology, the evidentialism of Rich and Earl, I think that's the view that they hold. And it's likely that if you endorse their way of doing epistemology, it's likely that that's the view that you hold as well. I don't have a good argument today that that view is wrong.
They hold this view because there's evidence they should have had.
Ah, beautiful, beautiful. Beautiful, Lizzie, I like that. Beautiful. So, I'll be honest, truth in advertising, I don't have an argument for you. If you actually endorse the doctrine of inertness, I don't have a good argument for you. What I'm going to do today is just tell you why I don't endorse the doctrine of inertness and why I'm not embarrassed that I don't endorse the doctrine of inertness. I used to be embarrassed. In the days when I thought I have this IOU that I have to pay off, I was a little embarrassed that I didn't endorse the doctrine of inertness. I thought it's just kind of one of these embarrassing things that you have to live up to. But I'm no longer embarrassed. I figured out why I'm not embarrassed. And I think I'm actually entitled not to be embarrassed. So we'll talk about epistemic appraisals and the, the variety of reactive attitudes. So Deb, I'm no longer embarrassed about myself. Okay. I'm going to, as I say, try to tell you why I think one can and perhaps even should live with the doctrine with the asymmetry thesis. But you might wonder, if you are of the sort that actually endorses the asymmetry thesis, so if you find yourself in my boat, you might wonder, why do we actually need to give an account of why the asymmetry thesis might be true? Why can't we just say, look, we endorse the asymmetry thesis because it's the cost of capturing the intuitions in these cases that the person is unjustified despite the fact that all the evidence she has would justify her in believing. Why can't we just say that's why we endorse the asymmetry thesis? I have two reasons why I want to actually give a little bit of an account of how it is that the asymmetry thesis is true. Two reasons. Reason one, the doctrine of unpossessed evidence can seem mysterious. You might boggle, and I have to tell you, I have boggled, at how evidence could have this status, that it can hurt you, but it can't help you. You might boggle at that. You might think, no, come on. If you have any evidence that's epistemically significant, the only fair thing to do is to say it can either help you or hurt you. It seems that there's something strange or mysterious about the idea that there could be evidence that can only hurt you. In fact, you might go so far as to say it's not merely mysterious, you might even say it's paradoxical. It's in order to address the looming paradoxicality of this that I would like to give an account of the asymmetry thesis. I want to show it's not paradoxical. On the contrary, it's to be expected. So I'm trying to move what might seem like a paradoxical phenomenon into the category of the to be expected. And the reason why I like this, the first of the two reasons, is that the reason that it's to be expected is exactly the core of this conference. Epistemic norms as social norms. That's the reason why I was so excited to be able to present this paper at this conference. Because what I realized was that that's going to be the way that I'm going to try to move something that might appear paradoxical into the category of the to be expected. Second reason why I want an account of the asymmetry thesis. I would love to have a better sense, more illumination on the relationship between evidence and justification. I don't often think about the relationship between evidence and justification. I'm a reliabilist, after all. But I recognize that if you do epistemology, you better have something to say about the relationship between evidence and justification. This is an opportunity to start reflecting on that, on the relationship between evidence and justification. And it's also going to make me feel a little bit better, even as a reliabilist, to be able to talk this way. So those are my two reasons for wanting an account of the asymmetry thesis. Okay. I'm going to try to do this in two steps. Step one, I'm going to try to convince you that evaluative assessments have, at least some evaluative assessments, have a certain characteristic, an important characteristic, and they have that characteristic independent of epistemic assessment or epistemic appraisal. And then what I'm going to try to argue is that epistemic assessments have this characteristic, and this characteristic is precisely what explains how we get the asymmetry thesis. What is the characteristic? Well, to spoil the surprise, it's this. For at least some, arguably many, though I won't say all, for at least some evaluative standards, when you appraise or assess whether a particular individual meets the standard, there are actually two different dimensions of, or two different things going on. One I'm going to call the explicit criteria that you use. The explicit criteria, I'll explain what I mean by this in a moment, but the second thing is what I'll call generic expectations. Generic expectations. I'm going to try to convince you this is a perfectly general feature of evaluative standards, at least some evaluative standards. You see it in places having nothing to do with epistemology. And then what I'm going to tell you is that when it comes to epistemology, you have the same structure, and that what normative defeat is, it's a case where the explicit criteria are satisfied and the generic expectations are not. Where do those generic expectations come from? They come from our social world. They come from our social world in ways that I hope to try to make clear. That's what normative defeat is. It's the epistemic face of a phenomenon that we've all seen outside of epistemology every day. So those are the two steps. Let's start right now. Step one, evaluative standards. I'm going to need some language, so bear with me for a second as I introduce my language. Let an assessment be a determination regarding whether a subject meets some standard phi. Let an assessment relevant consideration be any consideration whose obtaining bears on the question whether S meets phi. Then we can speak of assessment relevant considerations either as supporting or bearing against the claim that S meets phi. Finally, I'm going to talk about the property under assessment as being whatever property it is that one has when one meets the standard phi. It can be something as trivial as meeting the standard phi, or it could be something else. Here's my hypothesis. This is a mouthful, I apologize. There are assessments for which there are types of assessment-relevant considerations whose only significance is as potentially bearing against, but not as providing positive support for, the claim that S meets phi. The idea is simply this. When it comes to evaluative standards, there are considerations that bear on whether you meet the standards, but their bearing is only negative. It can't be positive. It's only negative. Okay. Before I give you my analysis of these, let me give you examples. I think once you get the idea, the examples can be multiplied, but let me give you my 4 examples. Example number 1. Consider assessments to determine who's worthy of serious consideration for the job. So we're part of a committee that's supposed to hire someone, and let's just call this is the first cut, making the first cut. We got 300 applications. There's no way we're going to be able to read all 300 applications in great detail. We have to figure out which applications are the ones that we need to take most seriously. So making the first cut is really the evaluation that we're making right now. Not who gets the job, but who makes the first cut. Clearly, there are explicit criteria that we'll use. They will talk about things like education, experience, and abilities. In the job description, we're going to make this perfectly explicit. These are the educational requirements. This is the experience that either we hope for or maybe even we require. These are the abilities that we expect any successful applicant to have. These are explicit criteria. And we might, as a committee, meet and discuss each candidate and say, at least briefly say, does he or she meet the explicit criteria? And we will presumably even be able to rule some people out merely on the basis of the explicit criteria. And so those people don't make the first cut. So question, do all of the people that look like they meet the explicit criteria make the first cut? Well, you want to say yes, but. Yes, but. Yes, in the sense that they look like they are qualified candidates for the job, but suppose you were to find out that Ralph, who is in that first category, is a sociopath. Suppose you were to figure out that Mary dresses inappropriately. Suppose you were to figure out that Johnny never bathes. Never bathes. You might well then say, how do you find that out, by the way, from a CV or a resume? I don't know. I have no idea. But just bear with me. Pretend this was possible. In other cases, I'll give you other cases. But suppose there was some way that you found this out. Johnny never bathes. Never bathes. The odor is terrible. You might well say, no, he doesn't make the first cut. We're going to rule this out. Notice, bathing was not something that you put when you advertised it in what used to be JFP. You did not put bathing down there, must bathe regularly. But I think it's fair to say that many of us would regard, at least maybe not in academics, we're a strange breed, but certainly in the business world, if you don't bathe regularly, you're not going to make that first cut. This is what I'm going to call as a generic expectation. What do I mean by a generic expectation? I mean something that we all sort of take for granted, something that goes without saying, something that you typically will only cite if you are worried that the expectation is violated in a particular case. Otherwise, you'll simply presume that the expectations are satisfied. But they're real. Because you could and you would rule people out if they fail to satisfy one of these expectations. Let's go to another example. This one is one that cuts near and dear to my heart. Assessments to determine who's deserving of her or his weekly allowance. If you have children, then you probably have to deal with this yourself. So let's assess. Suppose I talk to Judy and I say to Judy, my wife, let's figure out which of our children deserves the weekly allowance this week. Well, we ask who did their chores, who loaded and unloaded the dishwasher, kept the room clean, shoveled the snow, et cetera, et cetera. And we might say, okay, they all did, that's great. And we might then say, okay, so are they all deserving of their allowance? Well, we also have this thing in my house, and I'm willing to bet that more than one of you also has this in your house if your children get allowances. If you fought with your siblings this week, you don't get your allowance. True story. If you did not behave well in school, if a teacher had to call me up in the middle of the day or call Judy up in the middle of the day and say, sorry, but your son, your daughter is not behaving well in school, you don't get your allowance. These are things that are just expected of the children. We made this very clear. It's not like we pulled this out of the back of our pocket. We made this very clear. These are expectations. Generic expectations. We didn't make this clear with respect to just your allowance. This is our expectations of our kids generally. You behave well, don't fight with each other, treat each other with respect, treat yourself with respect, so on and so forth. If one of our children actually had a terrible week and fought with other siblings and didn't do well in school with the teachers and disrespected the teachers, that child is no longer deserving of allowance. Rule in the Goldberg house. Sorry, that's the rule. Let me give you some that you might like better than the potentially idiosyncratic features of the Goldberg house. Think about assessments to determine which researcher is Nobel Prize worthy. Which researcher is Nobel Prize worthy? Clearly there are more or less explicit criteria. You had better have contributed to your science, your field, and contributed in a foundational way, and contributed in such a way that it would be respected by a great many people. Very, very important work. If you satisfy that, it looks like you're worthy of a Nobel Prize. At least you're worthy of being considered for a Nobel Prize. I don't want to say you're worthy of a Nobel Prize, but you're worthy of being considered. But now suppose that it turns out that we have a person who satisfies the explicit criteria, but this person is an avowed racist, or an avowed Nazi, or an avowed sexist. Not just an avowed racist Nazi sexist, but somebody who actually is very proud of this and parades it all over the place. I hereby submit to you that the Nobel Committee would no longer consider that person worthy of a Nobel Prize. You might say, well, how can that be? The fact that they have this view over here, I mean, how could that be that they're no longer worthy of a, after all, they did foundational work in this area, this or that area of science, or this or that area of economics, or whatever the case may be. How can it be, since that's not an explicit thing that's mentioned, how can that be something that would disqualify an otherwise qualified candidate? Well, I think it's pretty clear the Nobel Committee would certainly use that as something to disqualify you. Let me give you one last example. This one is near and dear to my heart. It will be near and dear to at least David Henderson's heart as well. Consider assessments to determine which baseball player is Hall of Fame worthy. Again, it's much like the case of Nobel Prizes. To be Hall of Fame worthy, you had to have a long and successful career, and you had to excel in one or more of the areas, presumably at least as a batter or as a pitcher, and perhaps also as a fielder. And you had to make sure that that was sustained over a long period of time. Those are, if you like, the explicit criteria for being Hall of Fame worthy. But if you know anything about the recent Hall of Fame, you know that there are a number of individuals who actually are, by anyone's standards, satisfying the explicit criteria, but who are not actually being voted into the Hall of Fame. Why? Because in one case, several cases, they used anabolic steroids. And by the way, it doesn't seem to have mattered to the people who voted on this whether the steroids were used before, and only before, there was an explicit rule forbidding them in baseball. A number of the voters who talk about this said, as long as you were caught using steroids, we disqualify you. We're not going to vote for you. And of course, I'm referring to people here like Rafael Palmeiro, if you're a baseball fan. People like Barry Bonds is a famous example of this. Roger Clemens is a famous example of this. You might say not using anabolic steroids or any performance-enhancing drug, not consorting with the mafia, not betting on your own baseball games, a la Pete Rose. These are things that are expectations. They're generic expectations. They're things that we just expect of one another. This is one of the reasons why people who vote on the Hall of Fame candidates, it didn't matter to them whether or not it was an explicit rule of baseball at the time that the person was using the steroids. If they were caught as having used the steroids, according to these people voting, they don't want those people in the Hall of Fame. Why? Because it's a generic expectation that we have about competitive athletes that they will attain their competitive excellence in ways that we regard as legitimate. Again, a generic expectation, not the kind of thing that we typically will say, not the kind of thing that we'll make explicit until such time as we're worried that it's not been satisfied. Now notice something about each one of these cases. If, in the first case, someone came along and said, you know, you can't exclude me just because I don't bathe. After all, bathing was never something you explicitly said. We wouldn't be impressed with that. And in fact, if somebody came along and said, look, I bathe, isn't that great? Does that make me more worthy of being a candidate for your job? Bathing is not something they're going to get credit for because we expect this of one another. It's in this sense that bathing can only hurt you, not help you. But that didn't come out right. What I mean by that, the bathing requirement can only, that probably isn't said right. You know what I mean? Okay. Yeah, oh boy. Similarly with the weekly allowance. If one of my kids comes up to Judy and to me and says, but you know, I didn't fight with anyone this week. The answer would be, you know, great, but that's what we expected of you. You get no credit for that. That's what we expected of you. Similarly, if someone comes along and says, you know, I'm not an avowed Nazi. I'm not an avowed sexist. I'm not an avowed racist. The Nobel Committee would say, great, that doesn't get you any points with us because that's what we expect of one another. Finally, Hall of Fame worthiness. You can imagine Joe Schlabotnik, a lifetime 150 hitter, not a great hitter, making the case, yes, but I never used anabolic steroids. That's not an impressive case for the Hall of Fame. That gets you no credit. Again, the response will be, that's what's expected of you. That's not going to help you. What I'm trying to suggest with these generic expectations, they are the sorts of things whose satisfaction doesn't help you, but the failure to satisfy those things can hurt you. Why? Again, these are the things we expect of one another. You don't get credit for doing what's expected of you. This is what we expect. So, I want to suggest that you have in at least a certain class of evaluative assessments, things that can be broken down into explicit criteria and generic expectations. One comment about generic expectations is worth making right at the outset. And I take it that Julia, from her reaction to my comment on the Goldberg levy house and how we handle our allowances, this may be worth pointing out because it may be that you were responding to this. Not all generic expectations are legitimate. It's only when a generic expectation is legitimate that you can appeal to a subject's failure to satisfy it as disqualifying her. It's only when it's legitimate that you can appeal to the failure of a subject to satisfy that as disqualifying her. But what I want to say is this. When you have a legitimate expectation, I'll tell you in a minute what I have in mind by that. When you have a legitimate generic expectation, then I think you use those when you use them precisely when you think that an otherwise qualified candidate is disqualified because she or he fails to satisfy what you expect of people generally, or what you expect of people who are going to be assessed positively along this dimension. Of course, this begs the question, when are these expectations legitimate? That's a great question. That's a very hard question. I regard that as a question for social philosophy, perhaps for political philosophy. I've thought a little bit about it myself. My thoughts aren't so advanced on this. But roughly, the idea is this. We have social practices. When our social practices are legitimate, they themselves, and when our social practices themselves warrant these expectations, the expectations themselves are legitimate. So really the real question is, when are our social practices legitimate? That's a hard question. I won't have much more to say about that, although I will come back to that in a moment. So thesis. When it comes to a large class, or when it comes to at least some evaluative assessments, you can break down the assessment relevant considerations and put them into either explicit criteria or generic expectations, and you'll have a case in which an assessment relevant consideration bears only negatively, not positively, when you have a legitimate expectation that fails to be satisfied. That's precisely how these cases work. These considerations can hurt you, they can't help you. Why can't they help you? Because it's what we expect of one another. When you have that, you have a case that looks like it's going to set us up so we can make sense of normative defeat. What I want to do in this last section is talk about epistemic assessments and try to give you an argument for thinking that epistemic assessments work just like this. Epistemic assessments are yet another positive example of this, of assessments of this structure. That's what I want to convince you in this section. So, what are we assessing when we assess people epistemically? We're assessing a lot of things, but we're assessing features of in particular, of belief. I'm just going to focus on belief. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the kind of assessment that epistemologists typically talk about when they talk about justification. So what are you talking about, or what are you assessing when you're assessing a belief for justification? That was the question that I was trying to answer when I wrote a paper for the volume that David and John have coming out on the point and purpose of epistemic appraisal. That was the question that I asked myself. What exactly are we assessing when we assess for epistemic justification? And the answer that I came up with, I think is actually not particularly controversial. It's not particularly enlightening, but it's not particularly controversial. And it's this. It's you're assessing for the epistemic propriety of belief. The real question, I think, is what constitutes epistemic propriety for belief? And the thesis of my paper, the paper that I wrote, was that that's what the externalists and the internalists are arguing about. It turns out, for reasons that I tried to articulate in that paper, there are at least two big picture ways that you might actually have of trying to understand the nature of epistemic propriety in the way of belief. One of them is internalist, the other one is externalist. It's important to me that even though you have disagreements, and we all do have disagreements about what exactly it is for a belief to be epistemically proper, you have your reliablest answers, you have your evidentialist answers, you have your coherentist answers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even though there's a lot of disagreement there, there's one point on which most traditional epistemologists agree, and that is this. There are some criteria or other for epistemic propriety. There are some criteria or other for epistemic propriety. Most traditional epistemologists agree with that, not all. Alston has a lovely book. I think the book is called either Epistemic Desiderata or Against Justification, where he argues we're trying to collapse a multidimensional thing into one dimension. It's a bad idea. I think Alston actually had interesting ideas in that book. I think his argument was wrong. He's an outlier. If you contribute to the theory of justification, I think that you think that there are explicit criteria for epistemic assessment, in particular for epistemically proper belief. You might be a reliabilist. You might think that a belief is epistemically proper when formed through a reliable method. You might be an evidentialist. You might think a belief is epistemically proper when it's supported by your evidence, when it's adequate to the evidence, and so on and so forth. That's important to me because what I want to suggest is that what these arguments are over concern the explicit criteria for epistemic justification. But now what I want to suggest is that as in the other cases of evaluative assessment, so too in epistemology, we have generic expectations. This is arguably the more controversial part of what I'm going to say today, but I'm going to try to convince you in the 10 minutes or so that I have left, or how many ever minutes I have left, I'm going to try to convince you that in fact we do have these expectations and that some of them are legitimate. In order to do that, I need to give you my big picture, and I'm only going to argue for one of the, or two of the three claims in my big picture. My big picture depends on the following three claims. Claim one. We exhibit a profound, systematic, and inimitable reliance on others for what we know or take ourselves to know of the world. I take that to be a fact. We're social creatures. Part of the reason that I get interested in social epistemology is because I think that we haven't done a great job acknowledging that in our epistemology, but now we're trying to do so. Point 2. A good deal of our reliance on others is rationalized by the mutual generic expectations that we have and that we are entitled to have of one another in the various roles that we play, sometimes personal, sometimes professional or institutional, as we go about sharing information with one another. Point number 3, the point of epistemic assessment, given these first 2 points, is to capture a notion of belief-worthiness or belief propriety, that 1 is attuned to the materials the subject had to go on, but also 2 is sensitive to what others are entitled to expect regarding the materials the subject has to go on. And what my proposal will be, after defending 2 and 3, my proposal is going to be that you can think of dimension 3, small I, as capturing the evidence that a person has in her possession. And you can think of dimension 3, small I, as capturing the evidence it would be proper to regard her as having, whether she has it or not. And what I'm going to suggest is that our generic expectations, the ones that I'm going to try to develop for you in a moment, capture dimension 3, small I. What we expect from a subject, given the relevant roles that she plays and that she's manifestly playing in the various social practices through which we share information. So let me just give you an illustration of some of these. Actually, Deb this morning gave some nice examples of some of these, and one of the examples that she gave is an example that I'd like to use as well, and that's the example of relying on your doctor. When you rely on your doctor, you expect that she knows certain things. You also expect that she has certain evidence. You may not be able to articulate what that evidence is, but you expect that she has certain evidence. You expect that she answers to certain responsibilities. You may not be able to articulate what those responsibilities are, but you still expect that she answers to, you might call them professional responsibilities. You might recognize that the medical profession actually articulates them. You expect all of this of her. That is an expectation, a generic expectation that you have of your doctors. And that expectation rationalizes your reliance on them. That's one of the reasons that you rely on them for matters of health. Consider the following example from Holly Smith, from a wonderful paper that she wrote in 1983 on culpable ignorance. Holly Smith imagines a case in which there is a daycare provider, somebody who watches children, who was unaware of the allergies in the classroom for which he was responsible. He was unaware of the allergies because he hadn't read the list of allergies that was up there on the wall. He never read it. That's something that would be expected of him by all of the parents who bring their children to that daycare center. That was expected of him. He was expected to have known that. That's a generic expectation that we have of daycare providers. Last example, because the examples are easy to multiply once you have the idea. You might expect that the people that are building your house know how to build a house that's going to withstand the elements. You expect that they have this knowledge. You expect them to have this knowledge. You may not know how they have this knowledge, but you certainly expect it of them. Now, it's true that in each one of these cases, you might well have evidence that the people you're relying on have the knowledge that you expect of them, have the evidence that you expect of them. You may well have evidence for that. But the crucial point, and I think that several people have already used this notion in this conference already, the crucial point is that those expectations are not merely empirical expectations. They are normative expectations. Why do I say that? Consider the following. You learn that your doctor actually is not up to speed on proper treatment protocol for a certain medical condition. It's a medical condition that's widely known about. It's prevalent. She handles it in her practice all the time. If your expectation were merely empirical, then on learning this, you would say, I guess she didn't know proper treatment protocol after all. You'd give up your expectation. But of course, that's not what we do. It's in precisely cases like this that we appeal to our expectation and say, she should have known. She should have known. Similarly, with Holly Smith's daycare provider, he should have known. You don't give up your expectation because the evidence suggests the person fails to meet it. On the contrary, you use that very expectation to criticize and to have what I might describe as, now that I heard Deb's really nice talk this morning, that I might describe as epistemic reactive attitudes. These are normative expectations, and they're expectations that we have of other people. Are they legitimate? Well, I ask you, do you think it's legitimate of us when we find out that our doctor doesn't actually know the best treatment protocol for a condition that she regularly encounters? Do you think it's legitimate for us to criticize her? Do you think it's legitimate for us to criticize her when she didn't have the evidence? I want to say yes, clearly it's legitimate. This is because of the social practices that have evolved in our community, the very complicated social practices that institute the way in which we rely on doctors and others. That's what underwrites the legitimacy of our expectations, for example, of doctors or daycare providers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These things are legitimate, and when they're legitimate, people can either satisfy them or fail to satisfy them. But here's the important point. These expectations are generic in precisely the sense that I tried to identify in the previous section of this paper. Typically, you only bring them up when you think somebody hasn't satisfied them. They go without saying. But you will cite them if you think somebody fails to satisfy your expectations. And if I'm right that the failure to satisfy generic expectations can hurt you, can hurt the claim that you satisfied an evaluative standard, but the claim that you've actually satisfied those generic expectations can't help you, doesn't help the claim or doesn't support the claim that you satisfy the standard, then in fact we have shown what I think needs to be shown. It's then that you get the doctrine of normative defeat. So here's my proposal for what normative defeat is. Normative defeat, or normative epistemic defeat, is the violation of legitimate generic expectations of the kind described in double I. That's precisely what normative defeat is. It's when there's a legitimate expectation of you in whatever role or roles you're playing as an inquirer or as an agent in our knowledge community. When you fail to satisfy those legitimate expectations, and the form that takes is that there's evidence that you should have had that you don't have, where that evidence is such that if you had it, it would have rendered your belief unjustified, your belief is unjustified. And now you ask yourself, why should epistemic assessment be like this? Why should epistemic assessment care about evidence that you don't have? Why should it care about epistemic assessment? Why should it care about evidence that you should have had when you don't have it? Answer, because epistemic assessment is in the business of assessing how well we're doing when we're actually engaging in this communal effort to acquire knowledge. That's why we care not only about how reliable you are. That's why we care about not only how well your beliefs fit your evidence. That's why we care not only about how coherent your beliefs are with your background information. That's why we care about whether or not you have lived up to your epistemic responsibilities, or I understand those to capture our legitimate expectations of you. Our legitimate epistemic expectations of you. That's why we care about those things. Thank you. So I will not go over to why I think I can now give you a rational reconstruction of the Harmon case, the Kornbluth case, and the Pollock case. Why those do now count as cases of normative defeat. I'll just say this. In each one of those cases, I think you have a legitimate expectation that we would have towards the people being assessed, that they have certain evidence which they lack. And it's precisely because of the legitimacy of our expectation that they have that evidence that we can say that evidence is that they're not having that evidence is relevant to our assessment of their epistemic condition. That's why I loved Pollock's comment about we expect people to read their mail. I think he's onto something important there. He's onto the dimension of epistemic assessment that reflects generic expectations. Conclusion. What I hope to have convinced you of is not that the asymmetry thesis is true. I think it is, but I kind of am forced to think that it is. What I hope to have convinced you of is that it is the kind of thing that if epistemic assessment has the point and purpose that I'm claiming that it has, you would have positively predicted that there's this thing called normative defeat. Normative defeat is just the epistemic face of a much more general phenomenon. The phenomenon whereby you can satisfy all of the explicit criteria with respect to a given standard, but you fail to satisfy generic expectations. So in the same way that I wouldn't boggle at the idea that bathing regularly is something that you have to do, it's not going to help you get the job, but if you don't do it, it's going to hurt you. In the same way that I don't boggle at that, collecting the evidence that you ought to have is something that you ought to do. That you did it isn't going to help you. That is to say, it's not going to add anything more than what we already assess you for when we assess how well your belief conforms to the evidence. But not doing that can hurt you. It's the same phenomenon. It's the epistemic face of that phenomenon. So, what I want to suggest is that while it's often suggested, especially by folks who are proponents of the inertness doctrine, while it's proposed that thinking that evidence you ought to have as epistemic significance is seen as somehow bizarre, what I want to suggest, and this is the last word that I want to leave, and before we open up to questions, what I want to leave you with is the following idea. If in fact we do depend in so many ways, so systematically and in such an irreducible fashion on one another for knowledge, and if you think the point of epistemic assessment is to, as it were, assess how well we're doing in this respect, then I think the move to endorse the doctrine of inertness is itself epistemically blinkered by a kind of individualism that I think we should all reject. And I'll stop there.